Hello everyone, this is Major Green, also known as Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to talk some more about the recent news about Patrick Stewart returning as Captain Picard, which I am very happy about. There is one disturbing rumor that I heard a few people talk about, who say that the new series will be set in the JJ timeline, which obviously makes no sense. Why would they do that? I mean, the moment I heard about Picard returning, I immediately assumed that it must be in the Prime timeline, the original timeline. It would be set more in the future, which is exactly what most fans want, I think. They want to see what happened next, and it will also allow for more cameos by the other actors, the other characters, and so that might be great if they do an actual sequel series set in the faraway future, and we will get to know what happened next. It makes zero sense to set it in the reboot timeline. Why would they do that? So I'm not sure I believe that rumor. It sounds silly. I think it's all based because someone from the production tweeted something about that it will be set after Romulus is destroyed, something like that, which is something that was shown in the JJ movie. However, I don't think that means it will be set in the new timeline, because that would make no sense. I mean, Romulus was destroyed in the Prime timeline where the original Spock came from, and Spock came back in time, and then Vulcan was destroyed. But it makes no sense that Romulus would be destroyed in this new timeline that was created, because they know what happened. They know the backstory. Spock told them what happened in the future, and so wouldn't they save Romulus before it's destroyed in this new timeline? So this is a century before, and so wouldn't they at least warn the Romulans to let them know what will happen so that they don't get destroyed? So it makes no sense, unless they keep it secret to let them be destroyed, which is kind of nasty. I don't think Starfleet officers would do that. And so if they say this is after Romulus was destroyed, then it has to be in the original Prime timeline. It cannot be in this new one, because in the new one it wouldn't get destroyed. It wouldn't make sense for it to be destroyed again if they know it's going to happen a century in advance. And so I refuse to believe this rumor. It makes absolutely no sense. Why would they do that? The one thing that worries me is maybe they will go with the STD style, meaning they will have the new Klingons in the new show, which of course would be ridiculous. I mean, I'm sure we all want a Michael Dorn cameo to see Worf again. So would they retroactively change Worf to look like the new Klingons? I mean, we wouldn't even recognize him, so this makes no sense. So I hope it's not true. I hope they won't do something stupid like that. It would be okay to show more advanced technology and stuff like that, because it's in the future. I mean, if the JJ movies and the STD were set in the future, I would have far less complaints about the visual style. I would still complain, but I wouldn't say it's a continuity problem, because it would make sense for the technology to change in the future. But the way it is now, it contradicts everything. So how come technology is more advanced in the past, in the JJ movies and in STD? So that's one of the big problems. But in a new series, it would be less of a problem. I wouldn't have a problem with more flashy technology in the future. But changing the Klingons in the future would be a huge mistake, because again, Michael Dorn cannot appear, or if he will appear, we will not recognize him. Also, it would make no sense continuity-wise, because remember there was a scene in Next Generation in which Worf came in to have a haircut, and Mr. Mott even told him how thick and luscious the Klingon hair is and stuff like that. So how would that make sense if Worf actually always looked like the new Klingons who have no hair? So why did he go to get a haircut? So stuff like that wouldn't fit the continuity of the older shows. It would make no sense, and so that's why I refuse to accept. If they do that, that will be a total disaster. So no, if they show any Klingons, they should look much more like the original ones. They can do slight small changes. I would be okay with small changes to make them look a little bit better. It doesn't have to be the exact same makeup, but it should still be more similar to what we're used to in those series. And so I hope it's not true. I hope they won't go with this STD style, at least with the way that the aliens look. I mean, I hope they don't do that. And by the way, there's another rumor, actually not a rumor, the one who designed the new Klingon said that they will look different in season 2 of STD, that they're basically redesigning them again, which makes no sense unless they add some kind of explanation for that. Maybe it's possible, maybe they will start to move them toward what they're supposed to look like, so that would be good if they use some kind of excuse to change them toward what they should look like, so then that might fix that complaint. So maybe they will improve it, and if they have an actual explanation for that, then I will be happy. Then I won't mind it so much. So anyway, so back to the future series. So Picard is back, it's confirmed. Patrick Stewart said so himself, that Picard will be back, and hopefully it will be a continuation of the older series, and maybe we'll get more cameos of other characters from those series. Some of the TNG cast, even though a lot of them kind of aged badly, so that might be a little bit of a problem. Luckily, Patrick himself looks good enough, even though he also is kind of old now. I wish they would have done this sooner. But better late than never, and so, if I had to bring one character back, that would be Picard, and so I'm very happy about this news. I refuse to be pessimistic. I'm still optimistic. I think it has a huge potential to be great. It's almost like a wish come true for me. I really hope to see Picard again. Now, one problem is that he himself said it will be a very different Picard. It will be a Picard who kind of suffers from the weight of everything he's went through and stuff like that. So this sounds very much like what they did with Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. And so that is a cause for concern because they might ruin Picard in the same kind of way. But I think one of the problems with Luke Skywalker in that movie, I'd be fine with what they did in episode 8, but the fact that they killed him off, meaning we will not see him again, at least not in any significant way, that means he will never come back to what he's supposed to. He will never be the true Luke Skywalker, the hero that we want to see. So his last kind of appearance was of a more negative character, and then they killed him off. He had like a good scene in the end, and that's it, which is too little. But if he actually stayed alive, then I would be okay with that movie, with that part of the movie, because it's only like one chapter, and then later on he becomes the hero again. So if they kept Luke alive for another movie or a few movies, then it would make episode 8 more bearable. Like I'd be fine. I would even say it might be good to have like an interesting story arc of him temporarily being like a more depressed character and all that stuff. And so that's why I do think it can work with Picard if they only do that in the first episode or the first few episodes, but then he becomes again like the older Picard, then I'd be fine with him temporarily having some trouble. And maybe he should be actually suffering from that Euromodic syndrome that they said he will have in the future in the last episode of TNG, which was 25 years after the end of the show. And they said that he might have Euromodic syndrome in the future, which means he's kind of senile basically. So I think it might actually be interesting to actually see that. We know it was only a possible future, that it doesn't have to be the same way, and certain things have been changed already. For example, the Enterprise D still existed in that future, and obviously it got destroyed in Generations, and then they got the Enterprise E and other changes, so obviously it won't be the same exact future. And also, by the way, they said in that episode that Romulus was conquered by the Klingons in that future, and so again that doesn't really fit Romulus being destroyed by supernova and all that stuff, even though we can say it happened later. It might have happened after it was conquered by the Klingons, and so it first got conquered and then it got destroyed by supernova later, so it's not necessarily a contradiction. We never got an exact date in JJ's movies about when exactly it all happened in the future with old Spock, or Spock is very long lived, maybe it all happened after that 25 years in the future. And so it's not really an issue. So they simply shouldn't mention Romulus at all, and then it wouldn't contradict anything. Simply set it farther away in the future after all these events. And they should do that anyway because of how everybody looks. I mean, they all looked much younger in the last episode of TNG. Obviously, they were old because of makeup, and in reality, they look much worse than what they look like in that last episode. Even Patrick Stewart, sadly, his age is finally showing, and so it should all be set much farther away. A big problem is with Jonathan Frakes because he didn't age at all like they made him in that episode. And so one easy way to solve it is simply set it all not 25 years in the future, but even more. Beyond all of those events we saw in the last episode of TNG, and beyond the events of JJ's Romulus blowing up, all that stuff, and simply not mention Romulus and don't mention all those events, and then it wouldn't contradict anything, it wouldn't be a headache continuity wise. And also the character would look just right. Now, some might complain and say, well, that means Picard will be 100 years old in the new show, so that's too old. I say to that, no, because this is all science fiction, this is all in the future, and people can be much more long-lived in this future. In the first episode of TNG, we saw McCoy being 140-something years old, and that's fine because it's science fiction, so it's okay for people to live longer. And so 100 years old is like the new 70, so it doesn't mean anything. Also, I think it would be cool to see Picard's 100th year birthday on the show. That might be very nice also. So maybe the show should start with him being like 97 or something, and then he will become 100 years old on the show. And it might be made into a special episode or something that might actually be very nice. And so that's what I would do. I would set it all much further away in the future. and I would start the show with him actually having Iromodic syndrome, because it will actually make it interesting. Like, I would start the new show with exactly the same kind of scene we saw in that last episode of TNG, of Picard working on those vines of his family and all that stuff. I would do exactly the same scene. I would have someone visit him and say, we need you for something, only you who knows enough about something, and have him be a little bit senile and all that stuff. That might be fun if it's only for the first few episodes, or the only first episode, and then later on maybe they will find a cure or something, and then he'll begin to return to a more proper version of Picard. So I'd actually be fine with that. It wouldn't be as much of a problem as with Luke Skywalker, because that's all we saw of him, being like a senile old angry man, and then they kill him off and that's it. But it won't be the same here, because even if it starts out that way, he will gradually return to the hero that he was, and so I wouldn't have that big of a problem with that. It might actually be interesting. And also we know that Patrick Stewart can play that really well. We've seen movies of him in which he plays that kind of character. We saw that in Logan, in which he played an elderly Xavier, and he was also kind of senile and stuff. That was kind of interesting. And also the movie Safe House, which I think is a very underrated movie, by the way. I really liked it. He played a man with the beginning of Alzheimer's disease, and so he also kind of started becoming senile. It was a comedy movie, so it was mostly played for laughs, but there were also a few scenes, emotional scenes of him actually crying about his situation and stuff like that, and he played it really well. And so I think if we see something like that in the beginning of the new show, it might actually be very good. And then later on, as he goes on a new adventure, maybe he can find a cure for it, maybe a temporary cure, so that it won't completely disappear, it won't be an easy fix. Maybe he will suffer some symptoms later on. So it might actually be an interesting storyline, so I wouldn't mind that. Now, when Patrick Stewart talked about this new Picard, he said it will be a totally different character, it won't be the same Picard, that he will suffer the weight of things he went through and stuff like that. And so a lot of people are concerned, oh no, it's another Luke Skywalker, but I said to that, because it's a series, they will have enough time for him to actually overcome that and return to the Picard that we know, and so I wouldn't have that big of a problem with that. And by the way, they kind of did all of that in Star Trek Generations, Star Trek 7, when they killed off his family for no reason, and they kind of made him depressed and grudgy and all of that. So it kind of reminds me actually of what happened with Luke Skywalker. And I remember I hated that in Generations. When I first saw Generations, I thought to myself, why are they doing that to him? Why they are ruining his character? He was such an optimistic, such a great character in the series, and suddenly in the movie, they kill off his family for no reason, and those are characters that we saw in the series and we loved them. It was a very good episode, I think, when he visited his family, and they were very likable. At least the nephew was very likable, and it was kind of nice for Picard to know that he has a family. And even in that episode in which he was tortured by Cardassians, he kind of used his family as kind of his anchor to sanity. It was his way to keep himself from breaking. He kept thinking about his family.
What a charming picture. The Picard family. Is that what's keeping you from breaking?
And so it was like a nice thing to know that Picard has a nice family back on Earth, and so on. And then in the movie Generations, they tell us that they died in a fire, that they burned to death, which is a horrible way to go. And they killed off his nephew and his brother, and then he's totally depressed in the movie, and he's crying and he's grudgy and all of that. So I remember I hated that, but looking back, it was kind of necessary for the plot of that movie, because it makes him parallel with the villain. The villain also lost his family, and he's willing to go to extremes to bring them back, to meet them again. And yet Picard is so heroic that he resists that temptation. I mean, he does arrive in the Nexus and he can stay there, but he decides to go back because he wants to save the millions of people who died on that planet. And so despite his personal feelings of wanting to be with his family, he manages to overcome that and do the right thing. So that makes him much more heroic in a way. The only problem with that whole thing was that there was a line by Guinan that he can go back to any place he wants to in the real universe, not in the Nexus. And then it makes no sense, because then we think, wait, why didn't he go back and save his family in the past if he could do that? I mean, why not go back and arrest Soren in the past to solve the problem? Why go back only to the last moment? So I wish that line wasn't there. If they simply said he can only go back to a very specific point in time, a little bit before he arrived in the Nexus, then that would be fine. So I hate that line that they said that he can go back anytime he wants to in the real universe, because then he would go back only a few days and save his family. It wouldn't be a huge breach of the Prime Directive or something if he only goes back a few days, and he can simply arrest Soren and he doesn't have to fight him. So it makes no sense. So I hate that line. It kind of ruins the whole plot. If they simply said that he can only go back to near where the Nexus is or something, then that's the reason he can only go back to that same planet a little bit earlier, and so that would fix it. So anyway, so I kind of get what they were trying to do with that movie, and also that might help explain how Picard behaved in the other Star Trek movies, because the movie Picard was really not the same character as the series Picard. In the series he was very diplomatic, he was very polite, and yet in the movies he's kind of like almost like a psychopath at times, especially in First Contact. He's kind of shouting at everybody, he breaks things, and the thing with the Borg doesn't explain it, because in the series he also had an episode called I, Borg, in which he was also kind of seeking revenge and stuff, but by the end of that episode he didn't do that. In the end of the episode he didn't go all crazy on the Borg. In the end of the episode he realized that there are also people that can be liberated and stuff, so it doesn't make sense for him in First Contact to suddenly behave like crazy, to kill all the Borg and stuff like that, so it didn't really fit him. But we can say that because of the trauma of losing his family in Star Trek 7, maybe that's why he became that way also. Maybe it pushed him over the edge, and that's why he became much more aggressive and all that stuff. And even in the later movies, Nemesis, for example, also, he was behaving more like an action hero and not like the Picard we know from the series. He went off to face his Nemesis, Shinzon, and they had only enough power to beam one person to that ship, and then he said that that's something I have to do, and then he went there personally because he personally wants to fight and stuff like that. It doesn't really fit the logical Picard from the series, who would have sent the most qualified person who is able to complete the job the best. So he would send either Data or Worf to that mission because they are the most powerful characters. Probably Data would be the best choice to complete the mission successfully. So the series Picard would never have gone himself. He barely even went on away missions because the captain's place is on the bridge. And so the way he behaved in the movies really doesn't fit the character from the TV series. So killing off his family in 7 might be an excuse to explain away that change. So back to the new series. So what would they do in the future of Picard? So as I said, they already did the kind of stuff they did with Luke Skywalker. They killed off his family, they made him more depressed, more grudgy, more psychopath, kind of a different character. So I would be okay with them showing him farther away in the future and still suffering from these issues, and also having the Iromodic syndrome, which might also explain some of his mood swings and all that stuff. So it might actually be an interesting plot if it's only in the first few episodes and then something happens and he starts to behave like the old Picard from the old show. So I think the best way to introduce him in the future would be exactly in that setting of the last episode of TNG. Show him as an old man who doesn't want anything, who is kind of senile and he's kind of depressed and stuff, and have Starfleet ask him to come back to one mission because he's very much needed for something that only he can do. And then he reluctantly agrees, and then as the adventure goes on, maybe he realizes that's something that he wants to do, that they need his skill as a diplomat. Maybe he has some knowledge, maybe he has some personal contact with some alien species that only respect him, something like that. I don't know, like invent some kind of excuse of why exactly he is needed, and then someone comes to ask him to join, maybe another one from the TNG crew. Maybe, you know what I would do? I would have Worf be the leader of the Klingon Empire at this time, and they need Picard to talk with him because he only respects Picard. That would be a great plot point. It was also used in that last episode. I remember Worf wasn't the leader, but he was someone on the High Council, I think, and Picard basically got him to do stuff for him because they're old friends. So maybe do that. That would be cool. So, but hopefully the Klingons will look like those Klingons, not the new Kling orcs. That would be terrible. So have Michael Dorn as Worf appear again as well. Have him be maybe high up in the Empire. And maybe they need Picard because of his connection with Worf. So maybe start it all that way. So basically Picard is needed as an ambassador. They can say that he's a former ambassador, and they need him to become ambassador again, to come out of retirement, and then have him be on a starship and suddenly starting to remember how it was all like, and then his depression and his grudginess starts to decrease, and he starts to behave more and more like the old Picard we know. And maybe he even takes over the mission at some point. Maybe even sit at the captain's chair and become a captain for this mission or something, and have him be the diplomat, have it be a story about something with diplomacy, not just, not just destroying the bad guys, not just shooting, but having a story which requires some kind of diplomacy, which Picard was excellent at in TNG. So have him be that same old Picard that he's supposed to be. So I would be okay with him at first being problematic, overcoming his difficulties, and becoming like the older Picard. Now, how would that such a series work? I mean, would he be just an ambassador the entire series? I mean, if he's not the one who is making the decisions, calling the shots, that would be kind of strange. Unless the Federation grants him the authority to order to boss everybody around, then that might be okay. When I talked about this before, I said maybe he should be an admiral, and maybe he should be the headmaster of Starfleet Academy if it will be a series about the Academy. But I said that because I thought that he will have like a minor role, like he will only have cameos. If they only have like a few minutes with him, then have him be like a recurring character who appears once in a while to kind of lecture people and stuff. So then it would be ideal to have him be the headmaster of Starfleet Academy. That also ties to something that was said in the first season of TNG, in which he was actually offered to become an admiral and be head of Starfleet Academy. And there was a very good line by Riker, who told him that this is a wonderful choice, that he'll be able to shape the minds of the future leaders of Starfleet. And so I kind of think that might actually be very cool to see, and it would actually kind of fit him, because, there's a lot of scenes of him in the show being like a moral figure, being like a fatherly teacher figure who is kind of lecturing everyone. And also we saw Patrick Stewart as Professor Xavier, and he was also very good in that role, so it would fit him personally to be that kind of teacher-like role. And so him being like a headmaster of the academy might actually be very nice, and so maybe that's something he did later after becoming an ambassador, so that would fit his character and the actor brilliantly, I think. But I think it would only work if he has like a small role, but apparently, according to Patrick, he will be the main star of the series. He will not be like a small role in that. So then it doesn't fit, it doesn't really fit. Also, I'm not sure a Starfleet Academy series would be that good. I mean, if most of the characters are cadets, and the series will not be going out into space and stuff like that, then it wouldn't be that good. So maybe I would be okay with that being the first season of a new series, and then the cadet characters can basically graduate and become officers, and then the series can move on into space. And so I'd be okay with such a series starting out in Starfleet Academy and then moving elsewhere. But then what would you do with Picard? And so when I suggested that theory, I was thinking that he will only have like a small role, basically a few cameos. However, if he will be the main star of the show, as he apparently implies, then it wouldn't really work with him being the head of the academy. So he needs to be a more hands-on approach, and so maybe an ambassador would be the ideal thing. I don't want him to be captain. That would be ridiculous. If he's still a captain, I don't like that. It would violate the continuity of what we saw in the future, even though again it's kind of it was only a possible future, so it's not really a huge breach, and it might tie with what Kirk told him to just stay the captain. But I don't want him to be just a captain. It would annoy me. I want him to be at least an admiral or an ambassador, or I would even put him way beyond that. I would even suggest maybe in the course of the series, maybe something happens with the Federation, maybe some kind of political crisis, and maybe he decides to go into politics, and by the end of the show he can become the president of the Federation. That would be epic. That's something, maybe it's kind of over the top, but I think it would fit him perfectly. I mean, he's the kind of character that is good enough to have such a huge role. So I don't think they would do that. Maybe it's going too far, but that's what I would do. Maybe not from the beginning. I would start the show with him being senile and all that stuff. Then he goes back into the action as an ambassador and goes on various missions on a starship, not as a captain. He's the one who's going on the diplomatic missions. And then later on in the show have a huge crisis with the Federation is breaking up, something like that, and then Picard decides that he needs to go into politics to actually fix the problem. And then maybe he will win the election and become the president, and then become the policy maker, and that would be very interesting. I guess if he will be the star, then we can't really have the show about the president and what he's doing. So it wouldn't make sense in the middle of the show, but maybe toward the end of the show, finish the character that way, of him actually being the president of the whole federation. That would be kind of epic. I guess it would have to be kind of political, but I think it would be interesting. We kind of see the politics of the future, all that stuff. When we saw glimpses of that, it was always very interesting. But since it's a show for the broad audience and people want to see some action and adventure and stuff like that, and if he's the star, then I guess he would just have to be an ambassador and go from planet to planet and stuff like that. So I guess that's possible. Maybe he can be an admiral, maybe he can be in charge of a space station like Deep Space Nine, have it be like a Deep Space Nine kind of show, and him being the leader of the space station. That might also work. Or maybe have it be a branch of Starfleet Academy out in space. Maybe the final year of Starfleet cadets is out in space in some distant outpost, and he's the one who is kind of the headmaster of that place. So it can be like a mix of everything I've said, and still they can have like a huge crisis of the Federation and him going into politics. I suspect it might be part of the motivation of why Patrick Stewart agreed to do this, because he doesn't really need the money, and he used to say he doesn't want to go back to Star Trek, and yet he said that now they offered him something which tempted him to come back. And so I wonder what that is. I doubt it's just the money, and so maybe he's interested in the new kind of plot that they are offering him. Maybe they're really offering something that appeals to him. So I think maybe he enjoys playing all those senile characters like he did in Logan, for example, and he probably wants to challenge himself, so maybe that's part of what appealed him to come back as Picard. The fact that he'll be playing a more interesting character, in his opinion. And also, I think Patrick Stewart is kind of interested in politics. Recently, I heard some things he said, which I don't always agree with, by the way, in which he kind of goes into the political arena. So maybe he thinks he can use Star Trek to kind of present his ideas. Maybe he wants to do kind of similar stuff to kind of spread around his political opinions, his political influences using the show. Which is a very big danger, by the way. If they start to push kind of real political ideas into Star Trek for political agendas of today, then that might be kind of bad. But Star Trek was always kind of political, so I wouldn't mind having political ideas, but it shouldn't really parallel stuff that's happening today. I think that would be a bad idea if they start to push all kinds of agendas into the new series. But I suspect maybe that's part of what appealed him into this role, and he started to get really involved in politics lately. And there's a video of him telling people to vote against Brexit, and said that that's what Picard would do. So we do have some cases of him using his persona as Picard to promote his personal political ideas. So I hope he didn't agree to do this new show just because they promised him to do stuff like that. Also, by the way, I hate it when they let the actors write the stories. So I hope they won't let him to actually influence the actual stories in the new series, because that would be very bad. First of all, Patrick Stewart, he said so himself. He said he barely watched any Star Trek. Even his own series, he barely watched it. He said he's not a fan of science fiction. And also, he had a lot of influence in the movie Nemesis, and that was a really terrible Star Trek movie. And he pushed all kinds of his personal desires into that movie. For example, he loves race cars, he loves to drive, and so they created that scene of him driving around in that jeep in the desert, which was a terrible scene, and they only did that because Patrick really wanted that. And so this is an example of actors getting their hands into the actual script, which is often not a good idea. The same with Brent Spiner, by the way. He also kind of wrote parts of that movie, and he also said he's not a fan of science fiction. He's not a fan of his own show. He never watched his own show and never watched any of the other Star Trek shows, so he doesn't have enough knowledge to write in that universe. And also he pushed his own ideas in there. And so I think it's a bad idea. I think it's a bad idea to let actors who don't even like their own series to write episodes of the series or the movies in that same universe. So that's a very big mistake. If it's someone who loves their own series and is knowledgeable enough, then that would be okay. For example, Jonathan Frakes seems to be a fan of his own show, and he seems to be a fan of science fiction, and he loves his own series, he loves Star Trek, and so the movies that he made when he was director were really good. First Contact was very good. I think Insurrection was also okay. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't a terrible movie. So I think Jonathan Frakes is fine as a director. I'd be fine with him even contributing to the script, because he knows his own series, he watches his own series, he's a fan of his own series. He appreciates and respects science fiction. He loves his fans. He wants to please his fans, which also might be dangerous if you go too far with that. But it should be present. There should be some measure, some degree of pleasing the fans, to give fans what they waited for and wanted. So someone like Jonathan Frakes would be fine if he is involved in the script writing. But Brent Spiner and Patrick Stewart, I don't think they should be involved in any way in writing the actual stories, because I know from watching multiple, I watched hundreds of interviews by both of them and conventions, and they said themselves many times that they are not fans of science fiction and are not fans of Star Trek and not even of their own show. They didn't watch their own show. And so they shouldn't be let into the writer's room at all. So I hope they didn't promise Patrick Stewart that he will have a hand in writing the stories, because maybe he will start to push all kinds of political ideas in there, which might divide the fans and create political arguments with Star Trek in the middle. So that would be a terrible idea. I'd be fine with political stories, but not about current events in the news. Like, I don't want them to try to push all kinds of political agendas of today into Star Trek and to try to use Star Trek as a platform to promote their agenda. So no, I definitely am against that. So I hope that's not the case. I hope it won't be the case. That would be terrible. So overall, I'm still optimistic. I hope none of what I mentioned will happen. I hope it will be set in the future of the Prime timeline. That it will be the same Picard, maybe have more cameos by the other actors. Brent Spiner also, I'm not sure how they would do that since he's an android. I guess they can say he has an aging program, that he can look old because he wants to look old. You know, just like in that episode he said he gave himself gray hair because he wants to look older. So maybe he also gives himself older skin. Maybe they can do that like in that movie with Robin Williams, in which he played an android, in which he actually gave himself like real flesh to look like a human. So maybe they can do that. First of all, they can say that B4 became Data again because he had all of Data's memories. I think they did that in one of the comics or something. So I'd be fine with that, but then they can say that he looks older. Maybe they can even ditch the white color. Maybe they can simply make him look like a human, and maybe have one scene of him kind of putting on a new skin and looking human now, because that's how he wants to look like. Just like they did in First Contact, by the way. That was a very cool bit in First Contact, in which they show that Data has real skin, which is something he kind of always wanted. So maybe they can do something like that with him, and that would explain away him looking old. They can make it part of the plot, but still it might be kind of awkward. So maybe they can simply not mention any of these problematic things and just have it be a new series with Picard and maybe a few cameos by others in the future. So it might be good. So I want to be optimistic. I really hope they don't screw it up. I know one of the producers is a Kurtzman who wrote the JJ movies. He was co-writer of those movies. So that's a big cause for concern, of course. But hopefully they will bring in writers who actually know their stuff. I personally hope they bring some of the writers from TNG and Deep Space Nine, because they can write good stories, and so they should definitely recruit the best possible writers who know their stuff and who are knowledgeable enough and are fans of the material, and they will respect the material and have such good people writing the continuation. Don't hire a bunch of hacks and people who are not fans of Star Trek and who don't care about continuity, and they will mess everything up. So hopefully they will hire appropriate people who will do it justice. So hopefully they won't screw it up. So that's my thoughts on this topic. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and we can discuss it in the comments. And I hope to see you next time. Bye bye.